fact, it's my rule of thumb that you should never, ever believe anything the government says. Now, that won't make you 100% right, but it will make you almost 100% right. Once in a while, they seem to tell the truth maybe by mistake. So when they tell us and sing these paeans of praise to democracy and elections and voting and all the greatness of, quote-unquote, public service, i.e. being a professional criminal living off people without their consent, when they tell us all about these things, you know darn well it's all a lie, it's a trick, it's crooked. So I'm sure there are crooked D-bowl machines. I tend to think both the left and the right are both right about when they accuse the other side about crooked, and voter suppression, all these kinds of things, and then people voting 3 times, and it's all true. Both sides are right about the other side being crooked. Really, do you want to, it seems to me you have to ask yourself, do I really want to be part of this? I mean, it's a criminal regime. It's oppressing us. It's oppressing people all over the world. It's responsible for the murder of millions. It's responsible for the theft of trillions. It's engaged in its central bank with having brought on probably a worldwide depression. So this is just, a few of the achievements of this government, and we're supposed to think that by going and getting a little stupid booth in a government school after waiting in a long line and voting for the chicken hawk versus the war criminal, that somehow it's going to make a difference. What makes a difference is if we refuse to participate. It makes a difference for us individually, and maybe it'll make a difference societally if there are enough of us who just won't vote. Just say no to voting.
Well, and of course they would try to spin it as apathy or, the American people must think everything's just fine then if they don't even bother turning out to vote. But I guess if we could really, have one big year where people just refuse to participate and explain their reasons why so loudly that they couldn't spin it another way, that really could be, I guess that really is the only thing that could really shake the foundations of this state, is for the people to openly, loudly, in majorities, withdraw their consent.
I'm in favor of apathy. I like apathy. Now, apathy is not as good as what you just described, that is active refusal of consent, active dissent from the regime and its lies and its killing and its thievery. However, if you're apathetic, if one just doesn't care about the government, that is a huge improvement over being involved in the government. So better apathy than involvement in the gang, but of course, best of all, as you just said, active refusal to be part of the regime, actively saying no to this, as Murray Rothbard said, this gang of thieves writ large ensconced in Washington, D.C. Just say no to the thieves.
Mm. Well, one thing, I think this is something I read Jim Bovard talking about on his blog, was that he thinks that a lot of the belief that's been placed in Obama is really a reflection of just how disgusted people have become with what the Republicans have done. Starting wars, open programs of torture, openly warring against the Fourth Amendment and the rest of the Bill of Rights. People really want something done. That's probably a lot of the reason that so many newcomers latched on to the Ron Paul movement as well. That feeling of hope that we are on such the wrong track here that somebody's got to do something. We don't want it to get worse before it gets better.
Well, of course, you're right. Jim is right. The Republicans, I hate to admit this, I was once a Republican in ancient days.
You?
And I hate the Republicans even more than I hate the Democrats, maybe because in my teenage years, I was a Republican. So it's, they are horrible. It's absolutely right that people want to reject this and be rid of Bush and everything about him. And this is why, of course, they have the two-party system. This is why they have elections. So that rather than threatening the regime, rather than threatening the parasites, all the people who live off of us without our consent and rip us off, and live much better than the average American, of course. Never forget, the average government employee has a much higher income than the average taxpayer, so that these people, the way they prevent themselves from being overthrown when people get as angry as they rightly are against the Bush regime is you have the phony baloney second choice. Well, I'll get rid of the Republicans. We'll bring in the Democrats to fix them up. But Barack Obama and I have to admit, I actually thought he might be less pro-war at one point than McCain. How stupid I was. I mean, obviously Obama is every bit as much of a warmonger. He just is a more palatable warmonger than McCain, who's just obviously some kind of a crazy general out of an insane asylum, whereas Barack Obama seems like a reasonable guy. He seems like a gentleman, soft-spoken, and he seems like a nice guy. On the other hand, as Justin Raimondo points out in his column today on AntiWar.com, if you look at his foreign policy advisors, if you look at the people who are going to be running the killing machine in the Barack Obama administration, the idea that these people are, less pro-war than the McCainiacs, just a fantasy.
By the way, just for my own trivia purposes, that election that they stole from Ron, was that the primary against Phil Gramm for Senate?
No, that was another criminal election. No, this was the general election. He was the Republican candidate. The Democrats stole it, and again, the Republicans steal elections too. But it was a classic sort of old-style Chicago machine kind of theft. I mean, there were all kinds of phony votes, thousands and thousands of phony votes. That was the margin, as typical in the old days. I don't know how they do it today with electronic voting machines. In the old days, they sort of figure out how many votes they needed to steal, and then they steal them. They would create that number of votes, and it was a wonderful, typical Democratic election. So in '84, this was '76. In '84, he ran against Phil Gramm for U.S. Senate, ran a wonderful campaign, talked about the warmongering of the Reagan administration, why Graham was a warmonger, Ron Paul very much ahead of his time. It was interesting that Ronald Reagan, who would always blabber on about the 11th commandment, thou must never speak ill of a fellow Republican. And it was always important, obviously an idiotic principle, but this was his stated principle. He claimed all his life, no divisiveness, we love all Republicans, never intervene in a primary, never criticize a fellow Republican. Well, somehow that went out the window when Ron Paul was running against Phil Gramm, and Reagan entered into the race, denounced Ron, I'm sorry to say, the evil Phil Gramm, who went on to fame and ill fortune, our ill fortune, I should add, as senator, and now, of course, he's the chief economic advisor to McCain, also a guy who was heavily involved in Enron and many other scams, Phil Gramm. He became the senator and went onwards and upwards in the service of the state and the power elite.
All right, well, let me try, and I admit, I ran out of excuses. Well, I realized that this was an argument I needed to have, and so I interviewed Hans Hoppe, and I didn't really stand a chance, and I guess I haven't had an excuse for having a state since then. That was, 4 or 5 years ago now. But let me try my best, Lew, to make the minarchist case for you that I used to would have made back before I became an anarchist, and that is that, well, if we got rid of the regulatory state, and if we got rid of the welfare state, if we got rid of the everything state, and we really only had two major functions, national defense, keeping another government from coming and replacing ours and being worse, and criminal justice, the prisons, the court systems, fair trials for people that maybe, possibly, we could actually use the power of the vote and use democracy in order to, control our government, in order to provide for a reasonable national defense, not an empire of aggression, and for, what we like to think of as a pretty fair system of justice in this country in terms of rights of the accused and rights of plaintiffs and defendants at civil court and that sort of thing.
Well, if you're asking me, would such a system be fantastically better than the present system? Sure it would. I mean, to any extent that we could cut back on the federal government, it's a blessing to all mankind, let alone if we could say, go back to the original Constitution. That would be wonderful. On the other hand, as Hans would point out, first of all, let's say you're just going to have let's forget the so-called criminal justice system for a moment. Let's just say we're going to have national defense. Well, given that the government is an entity that has a monopoly of violence, and can tell you how much of your income it's going to take for what it wants to do, just the fact that it's in charge of, quote-unquote, national defense gives it the power to take everything. I mean, maybe there should be a tank in everybody's garage just in case the Ruskies, come over the pole. So, I mean, they can spend an almost infinite amount of money on national defense. But it's absolutely true. If you have a system like the original American system, if you have a restricted franchise, which would actually be the most important thing, the fewer the people voting, the better. Maybe you would just have a system where only property holders could vote because, of course, voting is, in effect, seeking to grab somebody else's property from them through the government for yourself. for most people, it's a fundamentally immoral act. I don't think if you're a libertarian voting for what they see as, you know, the lesser of two evils, or voting for a third-party candidate, that's not an immoral act. But if somebody's voting to get a war or more welfare or whatever, that's an act of theft. So the vote becomes evil. So if you only have, say, property holders, only as was the case in the original American view, or law for a very long time in the Swiss Republic, you know, that's better. But it's a fundamentally unstable system, as Hans points out. Again, because just given the nature of monopoly, if you've got a government that's a monopoly and can decide on how much it does and how much to charge for it, they will inevitably charge more and more and do less and less in terms of what they're promising to do for you, in terms of protecting you.